It's been too long.
The word deconstruction gets tossed around pretty often when it comes to media nowadays. In retrospect, things like Neon Genesis Evangelion are obvious deconstructions of the giant robot genre, for example. But to an extent, a deconstruction has almost become something of its own genre in the modern era. One of the main culprits of deconstruction as a genre becoming more popularized is, I would argue, Puella Magi Madoka Magica. Madoka Magica is a 2011 television series created by Magica Quartet, an artistic collective consisting of director Akiyuki Shimbo, screenwriter Gen Urobuchi, character designer Ume Aoki, and producer Atsuhiro Iwakami, often also featuring, though not exclusively, the musical talent of Yuki Kajira. The story follows a group of female middle schoolers who become magical girls in exchange for having a single wish granted, and thus are tasked with battling supernatural entities known as witches along the way. They become more aware of the vast consequences, both physical and mental, associated with their chosen duty as the story progresses, however. Naturally, it's easy to recall similar properties in the genre that Madoka is obviously riding on a familiarity of. Chances are, even if you've never been an avid viewer of magical girl shows, or even just anime in general, you'll likely have heard of something like Sailor Moon, Tokyo Mew Mew, Magical Do-Re-Mi, Pretty Cure, or any number of similar franchises. They're a very pervasive genre, and thus very hard to escape even just an osmosis-like knowledge thereof. For those of you less in the know, the magical girl genre is an oft-used subgenre of Japanese media which commonly features narratives focused on girls who use magic powers, or possess magic powers, and/or abilities. Magical girls usually transform in order to unlock these powers, and often have a cute animal mascot tagging along with them. They use things like wands or scepters, ribbons, staffs, etc. to fight monsters and advocate for love, justice, hope, and so on. Most anime historians would regard 1953's Princess Knight as the prototypical magical girl story, with Himitsu no Ako-chan from 1962 being generally accepted as the earliest true example of a magical girl series. The first magical girl anime was Sally the Witch from 1966, which was oddly inspired originally by the American sitcom Bewitched, an ABC series from 1964 about a witch who marries an ordinary mortal man and vows to live the life of a suburban housewife. Things changed a lot. Of course, the most well-recognized magical girl property is arguably Sailor Moon, which is considered to have breathed new life into the genre in the 1990s, and established more of a groundwork for contemporary takes on the genre going forward, introducing many of the tropes more commonly associated with it as well. While the origins of the genre could be argued to be very similar to the aim of most 80s product cartoons, essentially 25-minute toy commercials, there are still a lot of notable merits in and around the genre's most popular works when discussing media portrayal of gender roles, identities, and so on. Of course, when a genre becomes familiar to people, it can also become predictable, old hat, or even just slightly boring. This isn't to dismiss the positive traits of it, but it can take a shift to turn something tired into something that has new life. The magical girl genre somewhat stagnated between the 2000s and the 2010s, and this is the type of stage that was already set when Madoka Magica arrived on the scene. Madoka Magica has received explosive and widespread critical acclaim across the board, with most praising the narrative, visuals, art direction, and soundtrack, as well as the series' unconventional approach to the genre it submerges itself in. It won a variety of awards as well, ranging from the 16th Animation Kobe Television Award to the Grand Prize for Animation in the 2011 Japan Media Arts Awards. But what exactly makes Madoka stand out so much compared to its predecessors? What sets it apart from them in new and exciting ways? And how are we to feel about these things it brings to the table? Whether speaking on the subject of the praise it's received or the criticism it's faced. Well friends, that's exactly what we're here to discuss today. In this first part of this two-part retrospective analysis, we'll be covering the original television series of Madoka Magica from 2011, with the upcoming part 2 focusing on the sequel film Rebellion. Spoiler warning for all relevant material ahead, of course, and without further ado, let's get on with it. Madoka Magica began as the early inklings of a request from Akiyuki Shimbo to Aniplex. He wanted to make a new magical girl series, an original property that would assemble a pool of talented team members and which would foster an environment in which they were allowed to go crazy, creatively speaking. During the pre-writing and planning phase, the talent of Gen Urobuchi was brought on to sculpt the main storyline. For those of you not familiar with the man, Urobuchi has somewhat of a reputation for his writing style, which was almost sure to grab the attention of passing anime fans despite Madoka's somewhat formulaic outside appearance. Urobuchi's works very often explore dark and nihilistic themes, with tragic plot twists aplenty and no shortage of gore. He's perhaps most well known for the light novel and subsequent anime adaptation thereof for Fate Zero, a prequel series to the ever-popular Fate Stay Night. His proclivity for the sadistically inclined earned him a nickname among internet denizens with an anime inclination, Uro Butcher.
セクシーなコスプレイヤーともう素晴らしいイベントです。大変堪能させていただきました。ありがとうございます。
And then everyone died.
Iwakami's early request to Urobuchi for Madoka Magica's writing style was to make the storyline heavy, with Shimbo specifying it should include a lot of violence, blood, and main character death. Things that were, until this point, incredibly uncommon in the genre. Urobuchi being Urobuchi absolutely had no trouble racking his brain for the sort of depressive depravities required for the task, and set about creating a story which would charm and engage its viewers with their preconceptions of the genre and their attachment to the principal characters, and then harshly turn around and twist a knife in their backs. If you've ever heard fans of Madoka tout the common adage of watching at least 3 episodes to determine your interest in a series, this is intrinsically why. The series from the beginning was scripted with the express intent of sharply contrasting its marketing. Shimbo made a large push for Madoka Magica to be advertised as innocent and purely as possible, with the fluffy exterior and familiar genre conventions being tools of concealment to hide the lurking horror of the show's truly dour undertones. Hell, even the logo was deliberately designed to be soft and unimposing, so as to put people at ease when they saw it. That's dedication. Urobuchi himself even misled fans on Twitter deliberately early in the show's airing by giving red herrings and inaccurate answers to questions for the purpose of guising the team's true intentions. Although now, almost a decade later, it is fairly difficult for the uninitiated to come into Madoka well and truly blind to its trajectory, it has to be emphasized just how much people were actually fooled by this back in the day. The promise of Urobuchi as a writer for such a seemingly innocent show proved to be a good selling point to catch people's curiosities, luring them in with a quirked eyebrow and a sense of readied skepticism, which would slowly fade over the course of the majority of episodes 1 to 3, security settling in as familiarity took hold, only for the rug to be immediately and violently ripped out from under them. And this is kind of the overall feeling that Madoka Magica tends to inspire in people. Urobuchi deliberately studied things about the genre that often go unquestioned or overlooked in their narratives, and proved troubling if thought about from a more realistic perspective, and took these observations as further inspiration for the series' themes, citing additional influence from Stephen King, among others. This led to the formula Urobuchi decided upon for the progression of the initial pacing, a technique he credited to Kuroda in particular. The first episode establishes ambiguity by throwing the viewer into the middle with some kind of context being lost on them. The second follows by establishing the rules of the story's setting, giving a better sense of understanding over what's going on and where we'll go from here. And the third divulges a shattering revelation in the plot which entices the viewer to continue following along. The first episode sees title character Madoka Kaname discovering that a girl she's recently dreamt of has transferred into her class. Despite not knowing who this person is, this girl, Akemi Homura, warns Madoka not to change or she will risk losing everything. Later, Madoka stumbles upon an injured animal being attacked by Homura named Kyubei, who is then rescued along with her and her friend Sayaka by a magical girl named Mami Tomoe, who drives Homura off. Episode 2 has Mami and Kyubei both explaining to Madoka and Sayaka that Kyubei has the power to grant wishes, big or small, in exchange for contracting a girl to become a magical girl. Upon becoming magical girls, they are duty-bound to fight witches, who are beings born from curses, and whom create the type of labyrinths that the two girls stumbled into prior. Mami offers to take them with her on a witch hunt and help them decide if there's a wish they'd be willing to risk their lives for. Homura delivers a repeated warning to Madoka, but otherwise remains distant and mysterious, seemingly following behind as the trio find an abandoned building where a witch's curse has influenced a woman to attempt suicide. They save the woman from her fall before entering the witch's labyrinth, racing to the core where Mami engages in direct battle with the creature. Mami defeats the witch, earning a grief seed, which can be used to clear a muddied soul gem to restore lost magical stamina. And of course, episode 3 has the introduction of Sayaka's childhood friend Kyosuke Kamijo, who will become more prominent later. Madoka and Sayaka later find a grief seed that is close to activating near the hospital. Sayaka decides to enter with Kyubei to keep an eye on things while Madoka retrieves Mami, which she promptly does. Homura tries to warn Mami about the witch, but Mami binds her to keep her in place while they continue their descent into the labyrinth. Lamenting about her loneliness, Mami finally opens up upon realizing that Madoka wants to fight alongside her, feeling happy and confident for the first time in years. She shoots the doll-like witch Charlotte, seemingly securing an easy victory, before suddenly the witch transforms into a large caterpillar-like form and immediately devours Mami headfirst, instantly killing her. Homura, freed because of Mami's demise, makes quick work of the witch and claims the grief seed before leaving the two traumatized girls behind. If you've somehow skated by without knowing this happens in Madoka, trust me. From there, it doesn't get any better. Survivor's guilt, jealousy and betrayal, and a whole lot of monkey's paws await for those daring enough to peek behind the curtain, which is just beginning to lift itself by episode 3's end. It can be difficult for somebody new to the kind of subversions a work like Madoka offers its audience to see what exactly the merit of something like this could be. Indeed, one of the most pervasive criticisms I've seen of Madoka over the years is that it's torture porn that plays on an audience's desire to see girls suffer. To an extent, I can even see where this viewpoint comes from, but I'd like to take a step back and analyze this matter from the very top. Does suffering in media have meaning? Obviously, this is a very broad question, and if your answer to it just now resembled anything along the lines of, well, you'll have to be more specific, then that's good. That's what I wanted. Now, let's go a little deeper into those specifics. Looking into one of the main stylistic and thematic inspirations for the series itself should prove to point us in a fair enough direction, so let's start there. A very obvious and pervasive source of inspiration for Madoka comes from Faust, a dramatic duology by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, which itself is an adaptation of a 16th century folk legend. The first and most culturally significant part of the story, Faust, first part of the tragedy, was released in 1808, followed by a second in 1832. There are many obvious references to Faust on the surface of Madoka up to and including much of its premise mechanics, but to solidify the connection further, there's also writings on the wall in episode 2, which are directly German quotes from Faust. Now that we know this isn't a mere coincidence, what is Faust about? The plot begins with a prologue in heaven, in which the Lord God bets Mephistopheles, an agent of the devil, that he cannot lead astray the Lord's favorite scholar, Dr. Faust. Faust, meanwhile, is seen in his study, disappointed by the knowledge and results obtainable by science's natural means, deciding to attempt to use magical means instead. This fails, however, driving Faust into a depression only halted by the sounds of an Easter celebration. He goes out for a while, only to be followed home by Mephistopheles, disguised as a poodle, who then transforms back to normal and offers Faust a contract. He will do Faust's bidding on Earth, slaving away to help him experience life to the fullest, but if Faust is ever to feel completely satisfied, he will immediately die and become Mephistopheles' slave in Hell. Faust accepts the contract and signs it in his blood. Faust gets a youth potion from a witch and immediately thereafter falls for a girl named Gretchen, whom he conceives a child with. Fun fact, it's not really related to much of everything else, but the witch form of Madoka later in the series is actually called Kremheld Gretchen. It's a reference. Her brother, upon learning of this news, attempts to attack and kill Faust, but fails as he's mortally wounded in their fight via the help of Mephistopheles. Gretchen's good name is soiled in the eyes of the village, being that she is unmarried and pregnant, and Faust has to flee after killing her brother. He attends a Walpurgis Night celebration with Mephistopheles, the eve of the feast day of Saint Walpurga, an English saint who was an abbess in Germany and renowned for her power to heal the sick. It's also said that many witches gather on Walpurgis Night on Mount Brocken, the tallest peak in the Harz Mountains. At this meeting, Faust sees an image of a corpse-like Gretchen with a red string tied around her neck. The next morning, he learns that Gretchen has been condemned to death for infanticide. He plans to rescue her and arrives later to her cell where she is raving incoherently, and when she comes to her senses, she refuses to come along, thinking that she deserves her fate. Upon seeing Mephistopheles in the door, she prays to be saved by God, and a voice from above speaks to say that she is saved, as Faust and Mephistopheles disappear. The rest of the story gets kinda weird, but we've pretty much taken all of the elements we needed to come away with anyway. The poem itself is heavily entrenched in a sense of dissatisfaction and a gritting of the teeth. In the beginning, Faust is definitely very down on his luck, enough to contemplate suicide and immediately thereafter accept a pact which all but ensures his eventual and immediate death at his highest point of achievement. Kind of depressing. However, throughout the story, Faust's dissatisfaction often acts as a force that drives him kinetically to find another source of personal fulfillment. Of course, he never really achieves peace in mind before death either, but still envisions a bright future. This can be traced back as early as the conversation between the Lord and Mephistopheles in the prologue in Heaven. The Lord argues that it is natural for mankind to fall to error, but that despite this, he remains able to make moral distinctions. The issue at stake in these two forces wager with each other is whether Faust, a representative of mankind, will continue to be able to make that distinction, maintain the knowledge of what is good and what is evil, regardless of his temptation or his personal sin. In this way, the Lord in this equation views humans as inherently flawed, but also capable of cultivating themselves for good. Even though Faust is misguided often by his own hubris, he's also continually striving to improve himself due to his own self-dissatisfaction. This frustration and despair is eventually rewarded with entrance into heaven at the end of Part 2. In this sense, Faust's adventures, though tragic, have an ultimately optimistic outlook. They convey that mankind must find happiness through conquering their nature and living to self-improve within the circumstances imposed upon them. That one can find their place in a chaotic and seemingly uncaring world so long as they're willing to strive to participate in it, and make a positive effort to keep improving oneself.
ママはさ、私がいい子に育ったって言ってくれたよね。嘘もつかない、悪いこともしないって。今でもそう信じてくれる。私を正しいと思ってくれる。
Right off the bat, the parallels to Madoka, both obvious and slightly more hidden, should be starting to make themselves known to any of you with the passing knowledge of the series. For starters, the very first scene in Episode 1, Madoka's dream sequence, is literally named A Prologue in Heaven, albeit in the series' trademark cryptic rune language. The dream sequence allows us to see from Madoka's perspective as she dreams of something we'll later find out is a residual memory of a previous and defunct timeline, written over by Akemi Homura. In it, we see Homura fighting unsuccessfully against the greatest witch of all and biggest physical threat of the series, Walpurgisnacht. Sound familiar? Stunned by the horror of the situation, but unable to do anything, she is approached by Kyubei, who says that with a single wish, Madoka has the power to stop this tragedy and reverse the course of destiny. A step towards change, perhaps. This, of course, also means precious little when coming from Kyubei, as this little fluffball is certainly no Lord thy God in any equation. Kyubei is obviously a stand-in for Mephistopheles in this equation, and that's not just because he gets into your life by presenting as a cute animal who follows you home without permission. The contract Kyubei offers to the girls, one of becoming magical girls and fighting witches in exchange for granting any kind of wish that their heart desires, is similar to the bargain for Faust's soul. Faust sold his soul to obtain the toil of Mephistopheles, who would act as an agent on his behalf on the Earth. But once Faust reached peak satisfaction, he would become a slave to Mephistopheles in Hell. Contrast this to the magical girl system in Madoka proper. The girls wish for the greatest desire of their hearts, which is instantly granted to them without question. But this also places them directly into a position where they're forced to slave away, fighting against unknown assailants until their will becomes weak enough that they turn into witches themselves, perpetuating an endless cycle of energy farming for the sake of, entropy or something. The details are a little different, but the basic structure tracks. The monkey's paw-like nature of how the girls' wishes tend to go awry can arguably be pretty well grafted onto this framework too. Many of the greatest things Faust was able to achieve with the help of Mephistopheles often turned back around on him, biting him in the ass later. This always propelled Faust forward, however, and this only leaves the girls of Madoka Magica in tatters. It's just that kind of show. According to Kyubei, though, this is a pretty sweet deal he's got going on, and operating from his very mechanical and binary view of things, it's easy to see why an uncaring and unemotional race of weird furry aliens would view the losses as little more than necessary sacrifices. As he says, energy is being rapidly used every day, and to make more on a massive scale is basically the only thing keeping the world in balance. The transformation of magical girls into witches and their subsequent deaths create explosive amounts of energy, which more than balance the pool. And in their eyes, a handful of girls around the world is hardly anything compared to the many billions of life forms throughout the universe. There's also probably something to be said about the pain and suffering of girls being equated to a necessary sacrifice or cattle farming by who is obviously meant to be the main villain of the story, but more on that later. This balance of energy, or a dissonance between our wishes and reality, also becomes a fairly prominent staying force throughout the series. Kyubey even makes direct reference to this in his info dump to Madoka. Of course, the consequences of such miraculous wishes are astronomical, because they're literally unprecedented. To even perform them is indescribably costly, and wherever there's something gained, something often has to be sacrificed. It's a zero-sum game. One magical girl lives, another becomes a witch. When we eat from another life form, that life form has to die. As our society becomes more advanced and evolves, we end up exhausting the nature and our ecosystems. We risk creating a situation in which even our own planet cannot support us anymore. Madoka saves all of the magical girls in the series finale at the cost of not being able to be with Homura. Kyubey tries to save the universe at the cost of, well, these girls. An equilibrium, in other words, between suffering and happiness, where happiness is made possible by a foundation of suffering.
でも愚かとは言わないよ。彼女たちの犠牲によって人の歴史が紡がれてきたこともまた事実だし。
Now, that isn't to say that this is the only thing to come away from Madoka thinking, however, and indeed you'd be correct to remember that Kyubey's viewpoint will obviously be stilted in the opposite direction of our protagonists, considering he is the main antagonist. Those of us blessed enough to receive the privilege of a happy life don't deserve what we have, necessarily, as much as we're simply lucky to be in the places we are. Everything costs something. And sometimes what we have means that others won't. That's just a fact of life. However, despite that, it's important to remember that cynicism is not the answer to our problems either. Improvement, striving for meaningful change, that's always something worth working for. What was it I said earlier again? About the themes of Faust, a work that inarguably permeates throughout Madoka in influence? Faust's despair often served to propel him forward toward a greater self-discovery and improvement. No matter how insignificant you might rightly be in the grand scheme of things, you can make an enormous difference to somebody.
あなたを救う。それが私の最初の気持ち。今となってはたった一つだけ最後に残った道しるべ。
Humans are not simply numbers on a graph, after all. There are tons of us, but we also all have unique and intricate emotions and life experiences, informed, shaped, and affected by the people in our lives and the people around us. It's not easy to simply reduce those people in your life to numbers, is it? In that sense, everyone has a place in this big blue world, one that they can recognize and work to improve upon. And whether it's traded away for a selfless cause or lived comfortably in the confines of one's own home, it can always work to inspire and lift up others. In the end of the series, after repeatedly failing to make a difference in the one tragedy Akemi Homura wants to avert more than anything, she finds herself hitting rock bottom yet again. Confronted with the reality of making her dearest friend's fate worse and worse by way of her overwhelming losses, she almost finally decides to succumb to despair and quit fighting. But then, she stopped. Madoka arrives, and though she goes against Homura's wishes by becoming a magical girl, she makes instant and beautiful work of the negative and cynical reinforcements we've been forced to analyze over the course of the series thus far. Hope in the face of overwhelming despair is what it takes for Madoka to make her universe-shattering wish. Made possible by the karmic destiny she bears, mind you. For all of the time Homura suffered fighting alone, Madoka is finally able to use that power to unite everyone under one cause, one rallying cry, to have made it all worth it, to make it worth it forever. To destroy all witches before they're born is to take everyone's suffering upon oneself, but even then, Madoka's wish applies to herself too. If even she has no reason to despair, then they're no longer bound by a system that demands their suffering. And sure, it may not mean that they don't reach tragic ends. The New World is enough to prove this. But being willing to give up everything for a selfless cause, for what you believe in, is an admirable thing in its own right. Sometimes you have to be willing to give up everything to ensure a bright future for other people. Those people who will live without strife, who receive that in exchange for someone else's loss. This brings me to my favorite quote from the series, one that I think not enough people give credit to when talking about this show's themes.
希望を抱くのが間違いだなんて言われたら、私そんなのは違うって何度でもそう言い返せます。
That right there is the core of Madoka Magica. That's the center of it. This was never simply about being careful what you wish for, or the naivete of youth, or whatever else an edgelord on Twitter will tell you. Madoka is, well, to say it's thematically dense is kind of an understatement, frankly. But if anything, it is certainly hopeful, despite the many ways in which it appears not to be. In a way, it's just as much a story about hope as any other traditional magical girl anime, albeit one that acknowledges the more uncomfortable and twisted aspects of life, and still, despite all of it, tells us to keep our heads held high and our ideals strong, even in the face of what feels like overwhelming darkness.
大丈夫、きっと大丈夫。信じようよ。まどか。だって魔法少女はさ、夢と希望を叶えるんだから。
And sure, there are plenty of dark magical girl shows out there that have come out of the woodwork since Madoka first appeared, and many of them have royally missed the point in favor of shock value and effortless commoditization of girls' suffering, often to an uncomfortably sexual extent. But I think in the midst of that genre fatigue, or deconstruction of genre fatigue, and that justifiable discussion about it, it can be tempting to lose sight of the nuances present in the one that got it right. Because unlike many others of its colleagues, Madoka Magica never felt to me like it was turning suffering into entertainment, but rather showing that there is purpose behind it. That pain can often open our eyes to what work is still to be done. That dissatisfaction and despair, for as cruel and heartbreaking as they are, can also act as catalysts to light a fire in us, an inspiration to improve, and to improve things around us. And that's not to say that it's a perfect series, by any means. There is more to say for sure. But I wanted to establish this groundwork as to what I feel like the series offers beyond its surface-level grimdark reputation, and what kind of thematic resonance it can have with an audience. This has now set the stage for a sequel that went in a wildly different direction than many people were expecting. To this day, I feel as though it's one of the most polarizing sequels to anything ever produced in the anime world. And of course, there is a lot to talk about, given that it happens to seemingly fly in the face of a lot of what the series said and did, while also shedding light on deeper and more intimate character flaws of its previous heroes. The narrative through-line of this video, and the emotional conclusion of my journey with this material, of course, will have to wait until we can get into those details. Join me next time for the second part and conclusion to this essay, in which we'll be tackling, dissecting, and otherwise ruminating on the 2013 sequel film, Puella Magi Madoka Magica Rebellion, wherein we will also wrap this whole thing up and end out on a similar thesis statement as always. I hope you'll all join me there, because trust me, we're not nearly done with this series yet. And by the way, I know there are some other Faust things that I left out that are related to the series. Don't worry, I'll be getting to them in the next video. I'm saving it for next time, okay? Okay, thank you.